of comparisons to another high-profile trial. Even prosecutors in the Diddy courtroom made reference to music mogul R. Kelly's federal sex trafficking RICO trial from 2021. You'll recall that the I Believe I Can Fly singer was convicted by a New York jury and is now serving a 30-year sentence for that. So we have here a very special guest to discuss how these cases match up, if at all. Someone who knows exactly what it's like to defend a music star in this type of trial. We have trial attorney Thomas Farinella with us. Thomas, thank you for being here and joining us to talk about this case. You represented Robert Sylvester Kelly in his 2021 RICO trial. It was many weeks long, like this one. I was inside of that courtroom for that case, so I saw firsthand you defending your client. I want to know what your reaction was to this indictment. 4 years after your client went to trial and was convicted, Diddy's attorney said this is the first time no one has ever been treated under these laws like our client has. But I wonder if you agree with that, or would you say that your client was the first to use RICO or to have RICO used against him like this?
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here. So with that being said, the first RICO case that was brought regarding sex and sex trafficking was obviously the NXIVM case. That was probably a test case. Robert Kelly's case, was really the first RICO case that was commenced against an individual. And Robert Kelly was actually the entire enterprise. So it was quite unique. The government had never commenced a RICO case along these lines before. And it's been quite highlighted that after the fact that, you know, this very unique set of facts were actually tried and the government was successful. So I would say that Robert's case was really the first case. And during the trial, I often argued that if in fact this was going to be able to happen to Robert, that gives the government carte blanche to go after whomever else they wish to go after. And here we are.
Here we are indeed. I want to know what you think about whether or not this case that the prosecution is bringing against Sean Diddy Combs is stronger from a defense point, or if it's weaker, or if you think that this was an overreach in terms of the RICO used in the Diddy Combs case.
Well, so there's a lot of similarities. There's a couple of distinctions. In this case, the main distinction obviously is the drugs and the arson. The bribery, there was also witness intimidation in Robert's case, and then obviously the Aaliyah issues. But so in this particular case, you know, they're very similar. But more importantly, you see, the problem is that they are essentially criminalizing normal behavior, right? Everyday normal behavior, consenting sexual adult relationships. And I said this even during Robert's case. And so it's very difficult for the jury to delineate. So it's going to be very important for the defense to have a closing argument that keeps the jurors engaged and and allows them to pay attention to the fact that this is behavior that was consenting and adult behavior that was. And so, I think it's important to highlight the differences, but it's also important to highlight the similarities.
Now, I want to dig into that, Thomas, because you say normal behavior. And though I think the defense did something a bit different than I noticed that you all did in the 2021 trials, that they accepted a lot of the problems with the case. They acquiesced to domestic violence, to him being a terrible person, to there being these situations. This violence that we are hearing about and seeing, I think it's going to be hard for the jury to find that as normal. Would you say that was one of the most challenging parts, was to normalize some of this behavior for a jury in New York?
You know, and as a lawyer, I should have probably chose my words a little bit better. And when I mean normal, I mean behavior that is not illegal in terms of, you know, it's the underlying actions. Now, the domestic assault is not normal behavior. It's unacceptable. And I think the defense came out, they conceded it, and you have to just get it out there and put it behind you. And I think they're going to have to spend some time on that in the closing, saying, you know, we don't advocate this, we don't support this, don't take this as some sort of a cheerleader type of thing. But the reality is, when it comes to this very unique behavior, I'll say, it is, at the end of the day, adult consenting sexual relationships that the government is trying to criminalize. And the same thing happened in Robert's case. And there's so many similarities in the sense that there were witnesses in Robert's case that said that they were going to be promised certain things if they stayed with him. There was an incentive. I mean, there were incentives, and there were items purchased for these people, and there was a lifestyle. And I think Don Hughes testified, I know in Robert's case, to this financial abuse, because they're dependent on this person, the enterprise, or the person who's at the head of this. And so financially dependent, they would be able to be financially manipulated. These things have to be addressed piece by piece. I sat in Robert's courtroom for 6 weeks. The closing argument that the government gave started at 1:53, ended at 5:30 on the first day. Then on the second day, we started court, I believe it was 9 or 9:30. I'm looking at my notes. They went all the way to the lunch break. So that's another very interesting aspect in this case, is that the government had hours, much more time to make their closing argument than they did in this case, in Robert's case.
That's true. 4-hour limitation this time around, and yes, that was a lengthy closing argument. I want to ask your opinion, knowing what you know from that trial and looking at what these jurors are going to be weighing in this trial. Do you think this jury is going to convict Diddy, or do you think they may acquit him?
It's going to depend on the closing argument. It's going to depend on what the jury hears. See, and the defense has, and the reason why I mentioned the length of the closing argument in Robert's case versus this case is because the defense and the government and the defense will have about the same amount of time. The jurors, after a 6-week-long jury being inside the courtroom, and we actually were doing it during COVID, so it was even more restrictive, masks and all this other stuff. 6 long weeks sitting there paying attention day in and day out, and then they had an 8-hour closing argument from the government, and I believe that our closing went maybe through the afternoon, and then the government came back with I think a 4-hour rebuttal the next day. So, these are very critical. This is the most critical time in the case because the jurors are tired, and they're exhausted, and they're at the end of this line. So you want to make, it has to be very clear to them what it is that, from the government's perspective, that they were promised at the beginning, and were they given, the reward that the government promised them.
Real quick, Thomas, before I know we have to let you go, and it's been illuminating to have you discuss this case, especially while we are in these closing arguments. Tell us just real quick what the status of Robert Kelly's appeal is. I know you were working on that at one point. I don't know if there has been a decision on it, but if Sean Diddy Combs is acquitted of this, do you think that impacts Robert Kelly's case, if at all?
So new counsel came in for the appeal, but nevertheless, with the Second Circuit decision is a very difficult decision that was used a lot in Diddy's case, in pretrial motions and things of that nature. Now, I'm not so certain if Diddy is acquitted, it would help Robert to the extent that it will establish anything. Remember, Robert has 2 cases in 2 separate jurisdictions, and so it's a little bit more complicated. However, with that being said, if in fact he's convicted, the Second Circuit decision in Robert's case really makes it a difficult appeal.
All right, Thomas Farinella, thank you for your time and for sharing that information with us. Hopefully we will see you perhaps once we get a verdict in the Sean Diddy Combs' case. Take care. And before